Hello, and welcome to our session on mental health and well-being. I am absolutely delighted today to be joined by Katie Bott, who is an executive assistant at BHSF, Dr. Phil McCrea, who is executive consultant to BHSF and accredited specialist in occupational health, and Anna Mason from the Healthy Employee. And we thought it would be a really wonderful idea to pull together some experts, especially right now when mental health is becoming so much more prevalent within the workplace, to talk about how you can protect yourself, how you can protect your executive, and what steps you can take to make sure that you're aware before it becomes a problem. And so I'm going to kick off, if you don't mind, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, by the way, for joining us. We're delighted to have you with us. By asking you a question about the assistants themselves. Katie, can you tell me why you feel that assistants are in a particularly vulnerable position at the moment when it comes to mental health issues? Can you explain a bit about why that's the case?
Absolutely. I found in my experience that assistants are, well, we absolutely are in a position of trust. We are the point of contact in the business where pretty much everybody will come to us for advice, guidance, any questions that they might have. Do you know this? Do you know the other? I believe that because we're in that position of trust and we are very confidential in what we do, that people will come to us with their mental health concerns as well and their wellbeing concerns, especially if they're uncomfortable going elsewhere in the business, if they're not sure about the process they should be following, if they don't feel like they're getting the right support from their line managers. So I just feel that in general, we are that kind of contact group that people know that they can come and speak to openly, honestly, and kind of get the guidance that they're looking for.
Fabulous. Thank you for explaining. Phil, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, Lucy, thank you. And further to Katie's words, I mean, if I look at it from the executive's viewpoint, the executive position is a pretty lonely position in most organizations. They're the individual who's been tasked with leading the organization. And a lot of them who I've seen in consultation over the years feel that nobody is really their friend for obvious reasons. They might have to make very difficult decisions. And to a certain extent, that means they don't really trust anybody. That's why their assistant, who is seen as their closest confidant, sometimes becomes a shoulder that they lean on too much because they've nowhere else to go. The chief executive of an organization, there's a perception that they're expected to be robust and strong, forthright, and withstand all that's before them. But what I often say is everybody forgets they're a human being with their own personal situations and family issues, domestic issues. And I think it's very easy to use your assistant as that port of call when a bit of trouble arises, because as Katie alluded to, they trust their assistant. They know they're not a threat. They're not somebody who's angling to get their job. They're not somebody who's maybe plotting or scheming against them. They're there to support them. So I think that sometimes puts the assistant in a very difficult position for which many of them are not trained or experienced enough to cope with. So I think it's one of these unfortunate scenarios that evolves through nobody's fault, but can result in fairly significant consequences.
Yes, for sure. Anna, what do you think?
I think that most people can be subjected to burnout and mental health issues. We work with a lot of people, whether they're assistants, EAs, VAs, or whether they're working in other sectors and other jobs. And I think people can suffer from burnout and mental exhaustion for many, many reasons. And what makes them feel so with people that we work with is very often that they are working very long hours. They are suffering from stresses and strains that are coming at them from all directions, coming at them from their superiors, coming at them from their workforce if they have responsibilities, and they are trying to make everything work together. They often don't sleep particularly well, don't eat particularly well, don't necessarily look after themselves particularly well. And I think that that's a big part also of suffering some mental health issues, or particularly low mood. And I think we need to start to look after ourselves. I say we because I think we can all look at our lifestyle a little better and start to take better care of ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good point. I wanted to pick up on something that Phil said a moment ago about the executives working in silos. And what I would say to that is that very often the assistants are also the same way, because it's a very strange profession in that you don't have a department like other people. You don't have an accounting department or a sales department or whatever. You are an assistant on your own, and they work horizontally across the business. And therefore, if there's no network of assistants who they can sense check things with, very often they're as lonely as their CEOs. Quite apart from which, because very often assistants have a servant leader mentality, I think that they feel that they are the ones who are the fixers, they're the problem solvers, and they don't want to contribute to the problem. So they continue to say yes and to take things upon themselves rather than seek help to do that, because they don't want to be adding another problem to the list. And I think that's why quite often so many assistants burn out. Would you agree, Katie? I mean, I know that you suffered burnout as an EA. You've been kind enough to share with me some of your story. And I would love it if you could share your story with the audience, because I think it will be hugely helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree. And that's exactly what happened to me. I use the phrase no matter what. So I was very much of that mentality that that meeting need to happen no matter what. That deadline would be hit no matter what. The presentation would be done no matter what. And as I was going through that kind of approach and that style of working, I was adding more and more and more to myself. I wasn't saying no, or I wasn't saying yes, but can it be a week later? Can we do it this way? Can we do it the other way? I was constantly saying yes. On top of all of that, I was also supporting, in a previous life, I have supported an executive who was having some difficulties themselves. Picking up on Phil's point, you have those conversations that you're not trained for. I am definitely not trained to have those conversations, but you have that emotional burden on yourself as well. And you can't feel, or I never felt like I could say, I'm sorry, this isn't a conversation for me and you to have. I didn't know where to send the executive. I didn't know what help to get them. And again, no matter what, I was going to be there when they rung me. I was going to be there when they needed that shoulder to cry on. That then for me just led to a constant working pattern of work, and then emotional support for others around me. I had no time for myself. I didn't realize that I had no time for myself. I looking back now, I very much can see what was happening, but at the time you don't. I was working as soon as I woke up to the point I went to bed. I suddenly didn't have any time to go food shopping. And then I found that I didn't have time to eat. And eventually I didn't have time to wake up early enough to take a shower before I went to work. And my time just disappeared. And I was then struggling in terms of just my physical health then, because I wasn't eating properly, I wasn't sleeping, I was rushing around. So I had the emotional burden from others. I had my own mental health being impacted because it was just a constant, I must do this, I must do this, I must do this. And there was no kind of relief on myself. I didn't let myself have any time. And then I was also really physically ill. And very, I lost lots of weight, very, very, very poorly. Thankfully, I then joined BHSF, and I had loads of support from my executive then from day one. They allowed me to see that I was struggling. They gave me the time to realise it myself as well, which I think is really important. I think they gave me the opportunity to have those conversations and then look back on what was happening and understand that actually turning up to a board meeting with a tin of cold beans and a fork is probably not the best thing to be doing. You need to look after yourself, you need to eat better, you need to make time for yourself. And slowly but surely I was able to get the right support for me. I ended up having CBT, which really helped me understand that you only have 100%, one lot of 100%. And I was trying to give 100% in loads of different areas. And so that was kind of adding up to trying to give 500%. And that is just not possible. You're never going to be able to do that. And so slowly I was able to recognize where I could let go of things, loosen off kind of my own expectations of myself, be okay to say no, or can we try this? Can we do something different? And over a period of 6 months, with a lot of support from my colleagues, I was then able to get myself into a position where suddenly I was able to get myself washed and dressed and go food shopping. I was eating healthily. I was able to go back to the gym, and then I could focus on my work. And I found that actually I got more done. Whereas before I was very afraid that I wasn't getting through enough, that I'd drop things, that I would make mistakes, and therefore I couldn't let go of anything. Now, by looking after myself first, I am certainly much more efficient and much more effective at my job. And I'm also a much better support to my executives as and when the time arises, if they do need to have those chats.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Katie. You know, I think sadly, it's all too common a story. Anna, how can we start to recognise what the signs are of approaching burnout? Because I know that I've had conversations with some really very hugely successful assistants and executives who just didn't see the signs at all and kept just saying, I'm okay, really, I'm okay, until the day that they crashed and burned. What should we be looking out for?
Yes, sure. I'm really interested there to hear Katie's story, and I sympathise and empathise, Katie. I think what you've been through is quite shocking, actually, but what you've done is you've managed to reverse the burnout, which is certainly possible, and you're living proof of it. Burnout, it's a state of emotional and physical and mental exhaustion, and it's caused by excessive and prolonged stress of any sort. It's where individuals tend to feel emotionally drained. Their performance will be reduced. There'll be reduced creativity. There'll be exhaustion, mentally and physically exhausted, and a degree of apathy, certainly. An individual might suffer from headaches or stomach aches, and there'll be low mood, possibly leading to depression. And perhaps also there might be an erratic element to the personality. So somebody might be very low 1 minute or might be quite manic the next, for example, and might become a relatively volatile personality to deal with. So those are some of the things that we can look for. I mean, clearly that will differ from person to person, certainly.
There's that quote, isn't there, that says that if you don't make time for recreation, sooner or later you're going to make time for illness. And I've seen again and again people who are working in the way that Katie was talking about, finding that either their body or their mind at some point says enough. If you're not going to stop, I'm going to stop you.
Absolutely. And of course, there's several ways to help yourself, and it does often come down to recognizing it in yourself or recognizing it in others and making some substantial lifestyle changes, as Katie has done, and she's living proof of this, that it does actually work. But it takes courage, I think, to make those changes, and it takes support and help to make those changes as well. And very often that recognition within oneself that there is something wrong can be quite a long time coming. I think it's a need to listen to people outside of you and say, you know, perhaps there's something wrong, perhaps this is not quite going the way that you want it to go, and maybe you need to look at making some changes here for your own health and well-being.
Now, Phil, I know you're developing a solution to this problem that's going to support this group in the future and prevent all this suffering and distress that burnout causes. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, Lucy, but perhaps before I comment on that, I might just add to what Katie and Anna have said. And I think this is a very key message. I've been very lucky to have an extensive medical career. For 39 years, I've been doing consultations, and not so long ago, I calculated that I'd done over 120,000 consultations. Probably 2/3 of those were mental health issues. So that's a lot of people. Now, what's important to note is I never met anybody who was telling me a good news story. And I invariably met people who had been off work for periods of time before their employer referred them. The longest case being 10 years. But one of the questions I always ask in that consultation is, tell me when your symptoms first began, or tell me when you first noticed things going wrong. And I was struck, incredibly struck, by the length of time from the onset of symptoms to the person sitting in front of me. It could have been 18 months or 2 years. And what I always challenged in the individual is, why did nobody, including yourself, do anything about this in that period? Why does everybody wait until they fall apart before something happens, Lucy, if that makes sense?
Mm.
And it invariably revolves around the symptoms of mental health issues, which include embarrassment, shame, guilt. In other words, people don't want to come forward because they feel those emotions, or they feel they're letting their colleagues down or their boss down or whatever. And also there's an element of denial. And the other aspect is that people would say, well, if I get a holiday next month, I should be okay, or wait till after Christmas, or, mañana, at some point in the future, I should be okay. So I think that illustrates the problem, the length of time, the insidious nature of this illness, and the inbuilt resistance or obstacles to dealing with it. So I think the solution for me is to stop being reactive and start becoming proactive. Because if we wait for people to come forward, it's usually too late. Katie is very fortunate in that she was able to turn her situation around. Many people are not. And that's the sadness about this. Many people, by the time they get the help that they need, it's too late to make a difference. So what's the solution? Well, currently in the market, as everybody will be aware, there's a strong impetus towards mental health first aid training. That's become a very recently introduced mechanism to try and help employers and employees address these issues. And whilst it is a tremendously positive and an aspirational view, regrettably, I feel it's not going to be enough to tackle these issues in significance. The reason for that is that it's a very, very short training course, sometimes a day, sometimes 2 days. And although the individuals are tasked and given knowledge, unfortunately, they don't have the appropriate support, mentoring and follow-up to use that knowledge or to have that guidance. And I think many years ago, I used to provide first aid training, and we did a survey, and the first aid training used to be 4 days of training. And we did a survey that 21 days after you completed the course, if you hadn't done any first aid, you forgot everything that you were trained on. So I think that's going to be the issue. What I'm hoping to bring to the market over the next few months is a mental health champion training course, which will involve all of the components of the mental health first aid training that are excellent, but will also include that ongoing support, coaching and mentoring. In other words, provide that trained individual with external support to deal with maybe some pretty serious issues that are going to come their way, but also to provide direct access to the resources they need to help the individual, because that's something that I think people forget. We think we'll train somebody to be a mental health first aider, that's our mental health issue sorted out. But the problem then comes is the mental health first aider becomes overwhelmed because everybody said they're the individual who is the expert, and irrespective of how much education you give the employer that this is a training course, they're now the expert in that organization. But then if somebody with a mental health problem is usually pretty distressed, pretty emotionally wound up, engages with the mental health first aider who said, I will help you signpost the resources, and then they're told there's a 3-year waiting list to see that individual, that can then come back to the first aider as an issue or a problem. So I see a training course as being relevant to train the individuals to be proactive. So in other words, spot the people, identify the people who are not at the end stage, but the early stages of problem, provide that sort of go-to person, the training, change the culture in the organization. I often say we need to educate people that it's okay to not be okay. It's not a guilt, it's not embarrassment, it's not shame. It's actually part of us, because at any one point in time, 22% of the population will have an active mental health problem, which is a lot of people, or a lot of people. So that individual would be there in the organization to pinpoint people with issues, to address those issues, but more importantly, to have access to the support that individual then needed. So the sort of end-to-end solution, but in a proactive manner, rather than waiting for people to fall apart and then try and put them back together again.
Really wonderful, because my understanding of the mental health first aid is that it's far more an awareness thing than an actually how do we help people thing. And I think there's a good deal of confusion around that, because businesses are putting people on it and then assuming that they're going to be able to deal with any mental health problems that come their way. But of course, that's absolutely ridiculous. The amount of training it takes to do roles like the ones that you do, Phil, and you do, Anna, is years and years of experience to get to understand how to deal with people properly with mental health problems.
And I think, Lucy, that some organisations do recognise that, but feel that there's a need to put something in place to attempt to catch people. They recognise that really the mental health first aid training is about signposting, because you can't train somebody for 2 days worth of programme and expect them to be able to provide mental health advice. It is much more about signposting. But I think what's happening now with organisations, certainly that we work with, is they are looking for something a little bit more in depth. And I think that's really great that they've trained up some mental health first aid England trainers and in awareness and champions and actual first aiders, but they're looking for more. I think also, if I can just go on and say here that this is, as Dr. Phil says, really trying to catch people before there is a diagnosed mental health disorder. And I think we were talking about burnout. And I think that many organisations are actually looking to put in place solutions that will help to catch people and give people a toolkit to help them manage their burnouts before they get to burnout stage. So it will help them with things, to understand things such as emotional intelligence, being present, mindfulness, resilience, for example, as well as other things that Katie was talking about earlier, which is changing one's diet, paying attention to sleep, paying attention to the rest and the mindfulness, and just doing those things that we enjoy on a day-to-day basis. Because very much for us, it's not just about providing mental health awareness programs, it's actually looking at well-being in a holistic manner, because everything we do or don't do will add or subtract towards our mental health or our state of mental health.
Yeah.
And many organisations are actually looking at putting strategies in place now. I think they are so much more aware of the benefits of well-being. And certainly, we've noticed that with COVID, if there is a positive with COVID, that many organisations are recognising the real reason now to be much more proactive in terms of well-being as a prevention, not just for COVID, but certainly for other things. And they recognise that everything is much more in the round.
Yes, excellent point. I think it would be really useful to look at the assistant role at this point and to give our assistants listening some pointers as to what they should be looking for if they feel that their executive is particularly stressed and heading for burnout. Because there's a great deal of difference, isn't there, between day-to-day stress and just having a stressful situation and being on the point of losing it. So Phil, do you want to give us some ideas as to things we should be looking for?
Absolutely. And obviously this is fairly generic and everybody is different in how they manifest and present. But generally speaking, I tend to suggest that we look at physical and psychological early warning signs. So these are early warning signs. You're quite right. If somebody has a bad day, it may not be a bad week. It may just be a bad day. So I think it has to be put into context. But the physical signs usually revolve around sleep disturbance, as Anna has alluded to, is one of the early manifestations of mental health. People don't sleep very well. So they tend to be tired. And what happens when people are tired? They tend to be a bit grumpy, a bit easily irritable, maybe a bit agitated. So that's one thing to look out for. And that level of agitation can then develop into anxiety, short-temperedness, snappiness, intolerance. Those are features that an executive assistant would spot probably very early, because this would reflect a behavioral change. When it gets slightly more profound, they may find that mood changes occur with their executive. So they may become, at one end of the spectrum, quite withdrawn, quite socially isolated, quite non-communicative. And at the other end of the spectrum, they could become quite emotionally robust and profuse. And that's something, so mood swings from one to the other. A lack of interest, or a lack of motivation, or a lack of general get up and go is something to notify, because executive assistants will be bringing in deadlines for meetings, they'll be bringing in documents to check, they'll be bringing in minutes to be read, and they can spot behavioral changes fairly early on. And I think those for me are key aspects that an executive assistant would note, that my boss isn't just the same as they were. Things are changing, they're just a bit different. And it's probably at that stage that it's worthwhile to start those conversations. Now, the problem is that if Katie were to say to her chief executive, "Are you okay, Mr. Chief Executive or Mrs. Chief Executive?" then they're likely to say, "I'm fine, Katie," because of the obstacles we talked about. I'm fine. And that usually is a closing comment. It's very hard to go on from that. But I think what an EA needs to do at the next stage is to say, well, you're not fine. It's clear you're not fine. So, how are you? I'm here to help. Can we talk? You've got to not be put off by those initial obstacles, because the natural response is I'm fine. And obviously they're not. But I think those for me, I don't know if Anna wants to chip in, those for me are the little early warning signs that one should look out for.
Yes, no, certainly. Yes, I would agree with those early warning signs. And I think Phil mentioned, the behaviour change, volatility, perhaps in personality. Yes, I agree with everything that he said there. I don't think there's anything to add.
Katie, have you got some tips as to ways that you think you could better support an executive if you're worried that they are starting to burn out?
Yeah, so I think we, as executive assistants, we have that relationship. We have a very special connection with our executives as a kind of a golden rule. And I think that gives us a way in, for want of a better phrase, in order to start those conversations. I think we can come across non-threatening, that if we use the right choice of language and allow them the space to talk to us, I think that's probably the best route in my experience. The signs that Phil and Anna have listed there and things to look out for, we will notice those very, very early on. And it will be quite a shock to us, given that we are so used to them and how they work. So to see those behaviour changes will kind of definitely be more prevalent for us than for anybody else. And it is just about looking at how you can support their workload, perhaps give them some more gaps between their meetings, give them time to start to think of it for themselves, give them space so that they can kind of almost have that quiet moment. And maybe in those moments, they might say, "I'm not okay." Be there if they do need to talk to you, but be prepared to say, "I need you to talk to somebody else." Don't do what I did and take everything on. We are not trained for that at all. It is about signposting, and it is about getting them the right help. And one phrase that I love to say is, if you had a broken leg, you wouldn't keep walking on it. So let's make mental health as obvious as physical health. Let's do this. Let's treat it exactly the same, and let's get people the help that they need.
A fantastic point there. I often train that you shouldn't be afraid of your executive, you should be afraid for them. And I love your tip about putting extra time in between meetings, giving them space. One of the best things my EA ever did for me was to put lunch into the calendar. so that it pops up and reminds me that I need to go and eat. And in fact, one of the things I found particularly useful over COVID is time boxing. So rather than having that endless to-do list where you are tearing your hair out because it's like Medusa, you do one thing and cut its head off and 5 grow back. You know, I'm choosing maybe 4 or 5 things I want to do a day, and they go into my calendar alongside my meetings. So I get to the end of the day and I do feel like I've done what I was meant to do today. And I think that's another really good way of maybe managing that kind of overload that executives do get to. Can you give me some pointers, Phil, around what we could do on a day-to-day basis for ourselves to make sure that we're protecting our mental health and our well-being?
Yes, and I'm sure Anna will probably speak more eloquently than me on this, but I'm quite a simple bloke at the end of this, Lucy, and I think it's time to go back to basics. You know, when I've had very, very stressed and mentally unwell executives who sat in front of me in medical consultations telling me they work 15 hours a day, and I said, well, that's very ineffective because probably only about 5 of those are effective, so you might as well work 5 effective hours a day and take 10 hours a day off. That's usually in response to their, I haven't time for this. When you start to talk to them about it, I think the priority is that they need to make time. I think the education process, people need to realize we are not machines. An analogy I've often used is you can drive a car at 90 miles an hour in first gear because it will go, but it is not designed to do so effectively. So eventually the gearbox will pack in. So that is the analogy I've used over the years. And what I say to people is, you know, let's go back to basics. The correct nutrition. Somebody once said, we are what we eat. And when I look at what people eat, I wonder that they're surviving at all, Lucy. So, you know, we are what we eat. And we all are now very aware. We've got access to information that, you know, can educate us about the foods that are good for our brain function. We need to get that sleep and rest, you know, so sending emails at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. These are very, very bad practices. I once had a chief executive who actually timed his emails at 8 p.m. to go out at 1 a.m. to look like he was working late to impress his juniors. And I said, nobody's impressed by that. You're just scaring them. So, you know, it's about learning to live. I think you have to build in time for relaxation. And I often used to say, a friend of mine who was a teacher used to say, we should have one sporting hobby or exercise-based hobby. We should have one musical-based hobby, whether that's listening to music or playing it, and one creative or artistic hobby. Then you're the complete person. And I always thought that was great advice, to have that distraction or that ability to get immersed in something, whatever it is, that just takes your mind away from it. Anna briefly mentioned about mindfulness and things like meditation and yoga and even Pilates. All of these are tremendously positive about teaching you to breathe properly, to look after your body, to be in harmony with your mind. And the final point is, we need to bring back some humor into our life, because laughing, who said laughter is the best medicine? We need to find something that makes us laugh or entertains us or makes us smile. And that is one of the key questions in mental health that I ask. I call them patients, but I ask individuals in front of me, tell me what makes you laugh or smile at the minute. And everybody says, I can't think of anything. That's a real issue. So finding something that makes you smile or makes you laugh or makes you feel funny or happy, really critical. So you package all that together and you're well on the way to helping manage this.
Thank you very much indeed. Anna, I know this is really your subject, isn't it? The wellness piece of it. Talk to us a little bit more.
So I like this idea of time, and that is such a massive thing. You know, we work with so many people who just do not have the time. And they don't even have time to be polite in an email, however crazy that sounds. But often its brevity is everything. And it's really unhealthy. And it's not clever and it's not big to say, I work all these hours, I don't have time. Nobody is really impressed. And the example that you're setting for other people is not one that people should actually be following either. So actually building in time for yourself is really, really important, and you'll feel so much better for it, and you'll be so much more productive. And if you have a schedule of to-dos during the day, it's a realistic schedule, and I think, Lucy, you were talking a little bit about that earlier. A realistic schedule can make all the difference. There is only so much we can do. There is only so long for that we can be productive and actually make the most from our day, and we need to recognise that. And anything beyond that, we're going to become less productive, and it's very stressful for ourselves. So time is massive, and building in time is so, so important. Eating a healthy diet, hugely important. We deal with a lot of people that will skip breakfast very often. They'll have McDonald's, slight exaggeration, but for breakfast, lunch and evening meal. And it's unhealthy. Anything like that is fine occasionally. And it's not about being the diet police at all, but it's about thinking what we're doing most of the time and selecting healthier snacks and eating regularly. And it's not clever going all day without food either. People have these really strange thoughts sometimes that I should work all these hours, and I shouldn't eat. What is that going to do for us? It's not going to help. And we need to hydrate. We need to be mindful of how much caffeine we're having. We need to be mindful of how much alcohol we're having. Also, you know, caffeine and alcohol and a poor diet adds up very often to a very poor night's sleep, which doesn't help fatigue, which doesn't help our state of mind, and doesn't help our mood. We should be looking at regular exercise and changing our exercise as the seasons change. We're now going from summer, where we've had glorious daylight. Let's not say glorious days, because it's not been this year, but we've had lots of daylight. Things are going to change very soon, so we need to be thinking about winter type exercises that we can continue. And actually, that will help us to prevent us from becoming bored with doing the same old thing as well. So just thinking about exercise that you can take in the winter, that might be exercising at home, it still might be going back to the gym or whatever it happens to be, but maybe doing things a little bit differently is really good for us mentally and physically. Engaging in healthy sleep habits, looking at our sleep hygiene, taking some tips, joining things at work that will give us top tips about diet and sleep and mindfulness, etc., can be really helpful. Even if we only get one top tip, because we might be doing everything else, that one thing might make a world of difference to us. So being open to actually taking in advice also. And then filtering it so that it actually suits you and your lifestyle and your family. Doing things that we like, so mindfulness or getting time for you. It could be a true mindfulness practice in the real sense of something that's meditative, or it could simply be sitting down and watching an hour's worth of rubbish television. There's nothing wrong with rubbish television from time to time if it helps you de-stress and actually helps you to switch off and change your thought patterns. When you're thinking the same way all day, it can be quite self-destructive after a while. So doing something that you really enjoy, something that you can absorb yourself in. And the other one I would mention here is, and this sounds a bit fluffy, but loving something, giving your heart to something in a sense. And clearly for many people, that's their family, their children, etc. But it can be other things that you can love doing as well. So loving something, getting the most from something, really enjoying it, being absorbed in it. So loving the true sense of family, friends, pets, for example, but also loving something that you're doing. Even if you don't necessarily love your job, find something that you love to do, which brings me back to mindfulness.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Anna.
You're welcome.
So, Phil, at what point should we be sending people off to go and get more support, and what other support is there out there?
And that's a very, very, very good question. And to be fair, Lucy, it probably differs in individuals, but I think I've often thought over the years that when the fabric of somebody's life starts to show cracks is probably the time where something has to happen, because by that stage, I believe it's inevitable that they will go into a spiral of decline, and sometimes a pretty rapid decline. And by the fabric of life, I think that, you know, if their behavior is becoming more extreme and more regular, or if one is concerned about certain aspects of their behavior and that it's not just a one-off or doesn't last for just a few minutes, it's becoming more prolonged, then it's probably time to get them signposted to resource. And this now is the dilemma, because with the pandemic and with the tremendous pressure upon our healthcare system, accessing resource is becoming more problematic in certain parts of the country. So I think organizations, as part of their management of mental health, need to look at the access to resources for those people when they need them. Because if you're falling apart, to be told there's a 12-month waiting list to see somebody is not a really good piece of news, Lucy, if that makes sense. So I think it's about finding the right time to signpost, but also then having access to the resources when you need to signpost them. So I think the two go together, in my view. And I think part of organizations, Anna mentioned earlier about organizations are now very interested in well-being. I think providing access to resources should be a key factor in that well-being. And I think make it formalized. You know, have a policy for the organization, because then once you formalize it, everybody can follow it. Because let's face it, we all follow policies, don't we? We've health and safety policies, we've attendance policies, we've data protection policies. We follow policies. Put in a mental health policy and then we'll follow it, and put in the resources to ensure that when somebody needs it, they can get it. That will be my sort of key message to the audience who are listening.
And where do you start to do that? How do you start to do that, Anna?
So you need a strategy. And I think one of the good places to start is to actually look at your absence figures. And if you've got the details, understand the reasons for absence, if that's available. Another action to take would be creating a staff survey. Be careful how you word the questions in the staff survey. Be careful of the phrasing that you use so that you don't negatively or positively influence the responses, because what you really want is to understand a snapshot of their health and well-being currently. So start by understanding the needs of the actual workforce, and then I would suggest a health and wellbeing group, a health and wellbeing forum that can come together and discuss the possible and potential needs of the organisation. There might be several different arms to the organisation, so what might be needed in one department might be something different in another department. So understanding those different needs and wants, and importantly, how you're going to get those messages out there. So what's really important, what the workforce wants and how you're going to get those messages out there to individuals, and your data, how are you going to measure this? Because ideally you need a health and wellbeing strategy and health and wellbeing services and events that are really going to make a difference, not just tick boxes.
Yes, fantastic advice. Thank you so much. I'm going to come to each of you then, just as we round off, to say, if you had one thing that you would want to say to our audience out there to leave them with, what would it be? And I'm going to start off with coming to Katie.
So mine would be, no is not a dirty word. It's okay to say no. It's okay to start to push back, and it's okay to make time and space for yourselves as well as your executives. And I think that is probably one of the things we need to focus on as a group, to make time for ourselves to have lunch. It's happened to me today, a prime example today. I have had 20 minutes for my lunch today, and I felt guilty that I had so long. So it does kind of still get to me. It does still happen where you feel like you've got to be constant. So make the time, make the space, and use the word no.
That's fantastic. Anna?
I would suggest focus on a health and wellbeing strategy for your organisation. use the National Health and Wellbeing Calendar as a guideline, because obviously it's always supported by government advertising, such as Dry January, for example, and lots of other events that go on in the year. But create a strategy that your employees actually want and are interested in by also providing a survey so that you can see what people do want. Do some things for free. There's lots and lots of stuff out there that you can download and print off. Do some things on a face-to-face basis, do some things on a virtual basis so that you really mix it up. Use a company that's ours or similar to ours to give you some help and some pointers, and that's what we're there for. But get a strategy, look at health and wellbeing in the round so that you can address those main factors of lifestyle, and that will really help everybody on most levels.
Thank you. And last word goes to Phil.
Thank you for that, Lucy. Well, I'm going to take a perspective on the relationship between the executive assistant and the executive, which is obviously the conference theme. I think from the assistant's point of view, remember that your executive is a human being, not a boss. And treat them like a human being. So don't take no for an answer. Katie said no is not a word we should be frightened of. Well, therefore, when your executive says, I'm all right, leave me alone, don't take that as read if you're worried about them, because usually this revolves around an executive assistant being worried. So don't take no for an answer because you care. Nag them, poke them, prod them, factor in 10 minutes in their diary for you to sit down with a cup of tea and challenge them. Don't let them away with it. Because the success of this is if they accuse you of being like their wife or their husband, then you can say, well, I'm doing my job effectively because I care, and so does your wife or husband. And get them to open up. And I think the more courage that an EA has to challenge their executive because they care and want to support them, the greater the success of them confiding in you and allowing you to help them. And I think that's what we all want to do. We want to achieve a solution to the problem rather than ignoring it. So don't take no for an answer. Nag, poke, prod, and challenge. That's my message.
This has been a really, really wonderful session. Thank you all very much. And I know that the assistants out there will have found it hugely useful. So Phil, Anna, Katie, thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.